I opened my eyes before the alarm, before the sun had fully broken through the horizon, before the world outside had stirred into its daily rhythm. And the first thing that greeted me was not peace, but fear. It wrapped around my chest like a tightening band, stealing the breath I had not yet fully taken, reminding me before I could even sit up that today would be hard, that yesterday's worries had followed me through the night, that the weight I carried into sleep had not lifted, but grown, had tried to be strong on my own, all the times I had pushed through by sheer willpower, all the times I had told myself to just get over it, to stop being afraid, to be better, stronger, braver, and how exhausting that had been, how unsustainable, how it had left me depleted and discouraged, and even more convinced of my inadequacy. But this was different. This was not about summoning courage I did not have, but about accepting the presence of one who had infinite courage to share. This was not obstacle I will ever face. The darkness of night was different now than the darkness that had greeted me this morning. No longer threatening but peaceful. No longer heavy with dread, but soft with rest. No longer a space where fear could amplify and grow, but a sacred quiet where I could release the day I had carried, could let go of the worries I had held, could surrender the burdens I was not meant to carry alone, could trust that while I slept, he would remain awake, watching over me, working in handle. I wanted to close my eyes again, to retreat back into sleep, to delay the moment when I would have to rise and step into the demands of this day. But even that escape felt impossible because the fear had already woken me, had already claimed this moment, had already whispered its doubts into the quiet space between sleep and waking. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my jaw, the way my body had tensed without my permission, as if bracing for impact, as if where I had encountered God in a real and tangible way, where he had spoken into my deepest fear and answered with his deepest promise. I looked at the unmade bed where I had lain paralyzed by anxiety, at the window where light had gradually dispelled darkness, at the floor where I had stood and felt my legs gain strength, and I committed this moment to memory, knowing I would need to return to it, knowing there would be other mornings when fear woke with me, knowing this was not a one-time fix, broken parts, not hiding them or fixing them first, or pretending they did not exist, but bringing them honestly, vulnerably, desperately into his presence, and trusting that he could handle them, that he wanted to handle them, that he was not afraid of my fear, or disappointed by my weakness, or frustrated by my struggle, but was ready to meet me exactly where I was, with exactly what I needed. Morning would come again, as it always did, and with it would come new challenges and new opportunities. New, through a dam, and I felt myself drowning before the day had even begun. I had gone to bed, exhausted, hoping that sleep would bring rest, that morning would bring renewal, that somehow in the space between darkness and light, I would find the strength I needed. But instead, I woke to this familiar companion, this unwelcome guest that had shared too many of my mornings, this fear that seemed to know my name, that seemed to know exactly where I was weakest, that seemed to know exactly which thoughts, morning moment throughout the day, would remember the promise that he was with me, would return to it whenever fear tried to overwhelm me again, whenever I felt myself sinking back into the panic and uncertainty that had greeted me when I first opened my eyes. I prayed that I would have the courage to be honest about my struggles, to admit when I needed help, to ask for support when I felt overwhelmed, because vulnerability was not weakness, but the pathway to experiencing real strength, the kind opportunity to choose again, to remember again, to trust again, to bring my fear into his presence again, and hear again the words that changed everything. Rise, I am with you, and to let those words do their work in my spirit, pushing back the darkness, dispelling the fear, restoring the courage, renewing the strength, reminding me that I was never meant to do this alone, that I did not have to be enough because he was enough, that I did not have to be strong because he was strong, that would unravel me fastest. I lay there feeling small, feeling inadequate, feeling like I was pretending to be someone I was not, wearing a mask of confidence that hid the trembling uncertainty beneath. During the day, I could manage it, could push it down, could keep moving forward through sheer force of will. But here in the morning, in the vulnerability of just waking, in the rawness of a new day not yet begun, there was nowhere to hide from the truth of how afraid I really was. I was afraid of presence over my feelings, to trust his strength over my weakness, to trust that wherever I went today, whatever I faced, however inadequate I felt, he would be there. He would be enough. He would be my courage when mine failed, my peace when anxiety threatened, my wisdom when I did not know what to do, my strength when I had nothing left. I whispered that I was rising, not because I felt ready, not because I felt strong, not because I had figured everything out, but because he had said to rise, to be real, even when I could not feel it, even when circumstances seemed to contradict it, even when fear threatened to overwhelm it. I am with you, he had said, and I believed it, chose to believe it, would keep choosing to believe it through every morning that came, through every fear that woke with me, through every day that felt too hard, through every moment I felt too weak, because it was the truest thing I knew, the most solid ground I had ever stood on, the only foundation that had never, distance, not observing from heaven, not waiting for me to get my act together first, but with me, beside me, surrounding me, closer than my own breath, more constant than my own heartbeat. The simplicity of it was staggering. The power of it was overwhelming. The truth of it began to penetrate the fear that had seemed so absolute just moments before. I was not alone. I had never been alone. Even in the moments when I felt most isolated, most abandoned, most like I was fighting battles no one, there again sometimes, would probably greet me in the darkness and whisper its doubts and try to convince me I could not face another day. But I also knew that the promise would be there too, unchanging, reliable, true, ready to meet me again with the same words that had transformed this morning. Rise, I am with you. I prepared for sleep that night with a different heart than I had carried into the morning, not because all my problems had been solved, or all my fears had vanished, or to those who admitted their weakness and asked for help. If you go with me, I can rise. This truth, this promise, this reality settled over me like a benediction, like a blessing spoken over my life, like the last word, and the best word, and the truest word that could be said. And I rested in it completely, trusting it utterly, believing it finally, not because I had figured everything out, or overcome all my fears, or become the person I thought I should be, but because he had met me in my face it alone. The command to be courageous was not a demand to fake bravery I did not feel, but an invitation to trust in a presence that was stronger than my weakness, to lean on a strength that was not my own, to walk forward not because I felt confident, but because I was confident in him. The morning light continued to grow, slowly painting the room in softer colors, chasing away the deeper shadows, revealing the familiar details of my surroundings that had been obscured by the pre-dawn, crush us, wondering if we had what it took to keep going. And I thought that maybe the greatest gift we could offer each other was not pretending we had it all together, not projecting an image of effortless strength, not hiding our struggles behind false smiles and careful facades, but rather admitting our need, sharing our struggles, being honest about our fears and our dependence on a strength that was not our own. Maybe vulnerability was not weakness, but the pathway to real connection. The weakness and proven himself faithful, had spoken into my fear and given me courage, had invited me to rise and promised to be with me. And that was enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for this day and every day to come, for this moment and every moment that would follow, for this fear and every fear I would ever face, because he was with me, and he always would be, and nothing else mattered more than that, felt too complex to navigate. The expectations that felt too high to meet, the bills that needed paying, the work that needed doing, the people who needed me to be strong when I felt anything but strong, the problems that had no easy solutions, the conversations I was dreading, the disappointments I was trying to process, the failures I was trying to forget, the future I could not see clearly, the path I was not sure I was walking correctly. All of it rushed in like a flood, like water breaking, that came from connection rather than isolation, from community rather than independence, from trust rather than self-reliance. The morning had fully arrived now, the sky bright and clear, the shadows shorter and less menacing, and I turned away from the window to begin the practical tasks of getting ready for the day. But I carried something different with me now, something that had not been there when I first woke, something that had been given to me in the quiet, sacred space between fear and, differently, knew that true strength was found in honest dependence, that real courage was born from acknowledging fear and choosing to trust anyway. That genuine faith was not pretending to be strong, but admitting weakness and finding in that admission the doorway to experiencing God's strength in ways I never could when I was trying to be strong on my own. The morning seemed far away now, though it had been only hours. Seemed like it belonged to a different person almost. That man who had lain, preparing for a battle I had not yet entered but already felt I was losing. The light filtering through the window was soft and grey, the kind of early morning light that should bring comfort, that should ease me gently into the day, but instead, it only illuminated the weight pressing down on my spirit. I thought about all the things waiting for me beyond this bed, beyond this room, beyond this fragile moment of stillness. The responsibilities that felt too heavy to carry, the decisions that, those things. I began to pray again, but this time the words came easier, flowed more naturally, carried less desperation and more trust, less panic and more peace. And I talked to him the way I would talk to someone standing right beside me, which I now believed he was, not because I could see him with my eyes, but because I could sense him with my spirit, could feel his presence in the way the fear had loosened its grip, in the way hope had begun to seep back into the cracks, anxiety would still be speaking into my spirit if I had ears to hear, would still be offering strength if I had humility to receive it, would still be inviting me to rise, not in my own power, but in his presence. And so I slept, finally, fully, surrendering to rest in a way I had not been able to the night before when fear had followed me even into dreams. And my last whispered prayer was not a request for help or a plea for strength, but simply an acknowledgement of truth, a declaration of what I knew, failing, afraid of letting people down, afraid of not being enough, afraid that my best would never be good enough, afraid that I was running on empty and had nothing left to give, afraid that the cracks were showing, afraid that I was barely holding it together, afraid that one more thing, one more pressure, one more disappointment would be the thing that finally broke me. The room around me was familiar, unchanged. The same furniture in the same places, the same walls that had witnessed elimination of fear, but the presence of God within it, not the removal of weakness, but the provision of strength, not the absence of struggle, but the assurance that I did not struggle alone. Maybe courage was not about feeling fearless, but about moving forward even when afraid, about trusting even when uncertain, about rising even when every part of me wanted to stay hidden, to stay small, to stay safe. And maybe the greatest gift was not having all the answers, but knowing the one who did, not whispered one more thank you into the darkness. Thank you for meeting me in my fear. Thank you for speaking into my spirit. Thank you for the promise that changed my morning and carried me through my day. Thank you for being with me when I felt alone. Thank you for being strong when I was weak. Thank you for being faithful when I was faithless. Thank you for loving me not as I wished I was, but as I actually am, with all my fear and weakness and doubt and failure, and for promising to never leave. It had become how tired I was of pretending, how heavy the weight of constant effort had grown. I was so tired of being afraid, so tired of waking like this, so tired of carrying this burden alone. My mind raced through the day ahead, trying to plan, trying to prepare, trying to find some sense of control in the chaos. But each thought only led to another worry, another what if, another scenario where things went wrong, where I made the wrong choice, where I said the wrong thing, where I missed. But a daily practice, a continual choice to remember, to trust, to believe that the promise was still true even when I could not feel it as strongly, that He was still with me even when I could not sense His presence as clearly. I picked up my phone, my keys, the things I would need for the day, and I walked toward the door, ready now in a way I had not been before, not because everything had been resolved, not because all my questions had been answered, not because I suddenly felt completely. Light always returned, that new mercies came every morning, that God's faithfulness was as reliable as the sunrise, as constant as the turning of the earth, as unchanging as the laws that governed the universe He had created. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again, and I would rise with it. And whether I woke in fear or peace or somewhere in between, the promise would still be true. The presence would still be real. And I would still have access to the courage I needed, because He would still be still carrying the same responsibilities I had carried into sleep, but seeing them through the lens of this promise, this presence, this assurance that I was not expected to navigate it all in my own strength. The meeting I was dreading, He would be there. The conversation I did not know how to have, He would give me words. The decision I was uncertain about, He would provide wisdom. The fear I could not shake, He would be my courage. The weakness I felt so acutely, He would be my strength. It would be with me through every moment of the next, and the next, and the next, for all the days of my life, because He had promised, and His promises did not expire, did not come with conditions, did not depend on my performance or my feelings, or my ability to maintain perfect faith. His promises were rooted in His character, were expressions of who He was, and who He was did not change when I changed, did not waver when I wavered, did not fail when I failed. Sleep began to pull at me, that gentle me, exactly where I was. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Do not be afraid, not because there was nothing to fear, not because the challenges were not real, not because the obstacles were not significant, but because the presence of God was greater than any fear, because His strength was available when mine ran out, because wherever I had to go, whatever I had to face, I would not, needed, not all at once, not in unlimited supply, not making everything easy, but enough, always enough, exactly enough for each moment, each challenge, each step, enough courage to keep going, enough strength to keep standing, enough peace to keep breathing, enough faith to keep trusting that I was not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone because He had promised, and His promises were more certain than my fears. As evening approached, and the day that had seemed so terrifying in my spirit as I fell completely into sleep, "Rise, I am with you." And I knew that when morning came, I would need those words again, would need to remember them, would need to let them do their work of pushing back fear and restoring courage, would need to choose again to trust them over the voices that would tell me I was not enough, that I could not do this, that I should be afraid, that I was alone in my struggle. But for now, in this moment, in this peaceful darkness, in this sacred space of heavier in the darkness, my heart was already racing, pounding against my ribs as if trying to escape, and I lay there in the half-light of early morning, staring at the ceiling, feeling the familiar dread settle into my bones. The shadows in the room seemed deeper than they should be, the silence heavier, and I could feel the anxious thoughts beginning their relentless march through my mind, each one a reminder of everything I had to face, everything I was not sure I was strong enough to. Created, in the way I was able to stand here at this window, preparing to face a day that had seemed impossible just minutes ago. I told him about the specific fears, the specific worries, the specific challenges that had woken me in such distress, not because he did not already know, but because speaking them out loud, bringing them into the light, acknowledging them in his presence, somehow diminished their power, somehow made them feel more manageable, somehow reminded me that I did not have to. Something had been restored, something had been renewed by the simple act of bringing my fear into the presence of God and having it met not with rebuke or disappointment, but with promise and presence and the invitation to rise. This was what I would need to remember, what I would need to return to again and again, what I would need to practice until it became as natural as breathing, this bringing of my whole self to him. The fearful parts and the weak parts and the uncertain parts and the weakness and strength, uncertainty and trust, and that the presence of one does not negate the possibility of the other. The shadows would remain throughout the day, shifting and changing, but never completely disappearing, just as the fears and challenges would not magically vanish, but the light was stronger, was growing, was pushing back the darkness with steady persistence. And I could choose which one I would focus on, which one I would allow to define my day. I thought about all the times what you have already done, not leaning on my understanding, but on your wisdom, not walking in my courage, but in the courage you provide moment by moment, breath by breath, step by step through every uncertain path, every difficult conversation, every overwhelming responsibility, every shadowed valley, every steep climb. I will rise because you have commanded it, promised it, made it possible. And your word is more certain than my fear, more reliable than my feelings, more powerful than any. Was drowning while everyone else swam effortlessly. I felt connected to it, part of it, one person among many who would face this day with varying degrees of fear and faith, struggle and strength, uncertainty and hope. I was not the only one who woke afraid. I was not the only one who felt inadequate. I was not the only one who needed courage beyond what I naturally possessed. But I was known by the one who could provide all of that, who had promised to be with me, who had invited me to rise, not strength when I had felt depleted, in words that came when I had not known what to say, in peace that settled when anxiety had threatened to overwhelm, in the ability to keep putting one foot in front of the other when everything in me had wanted to quit. Each of these moments had been evidence of the promise, confirmation that I was not alone, that he was with me just as he had said, that the words spoken into my spirit in the quiet of the morning were not wishful thinking but solid truth. Not who greeted each day with hope, who faced challenges with unwavering faith, but instead I was this, a man lying in bed paralyzed by anxiety, unable to find the courage to even sit up, unable to silence the voices telling me I was not strong enough, not brave enough, not capable enough for what this day would demand of me. I thought about all the times I had tried to be strong, all the times I had pushed through despite the fear, all the times I had told myself I could do this, and how exhausting, upright, like the fog had cleared enough for me to see the next step, even if I could not see the entire path. I thought about how many times I had tried to pray away my fear, had asked God to remove it entirely, to make me instantly brave, to take away the anxiety and replace it with perfect peace, and how often I had felt disappointed when that did not happen, when the fear persisted, when I still woke trembling and uncertain. But maybe that was not how it worked. Maybe the point was not the grace, not dependent on my worthiness, but flowing from his character, from who he was rather than who I was, from his decision to love me, to be with me, to never leave me, regardless of how many times I stumbled, how many times I failed, how many times I woke in fear and doubt and wondered if I could keep going. His presence was not the prize at the end of perfection, but the power that carried me through imperfection, not waiting for me to get strong, but being my strength in weakness, not felt weak and uncertain and completely overwhelmed, that I needed strength I did not have, courage I could not find, peace that seemed impossibly far away. I whispered that I was tired of fighting alone, tired of pretending I had it all together, tired of waking to fear instead of hope. And I asked with a rawness that surprised even me, for him to help me, to meet me here in this moment, to show me that I was not facing this day alone, to give me whatever it was I needed to rise, to step, having all the strength, but being connected to the source of all strength. Not having perfect faith, but having a perfect God who met me in my imperfect faith with grace and patience and unfailing presence. I finished getting ready and stood for a moment in the center of my room, the same room that had felt so dark and oppressive when I first woke, that had seemed to echo with all my fears and amplify all my doubts, but that now felt different, felt like holy ground somehow, felt like a place, failed me, the promise that made rising possible when everything in me wanted to stay hidden, to stay small, to stay safe in the familiar prison of fear. The night wrapped around me like a blanket, gentle and dark and peaceful, so different from the way it had felt when I had lain down the night before. And I understood that nothing external had changed, that the room was the same, that the bed was the same, that the circumstances of my life were the same. But something internal had shifted. The room. The light through the window seemed softer somehow, less harsh, more gentle, and as I lay there with my eyes closed, I became aware of my own breathing, of the way it had begun to slow without me consciously trying, of the way the tension in my shoulders was beginning to ease just slightly, of the way the racing thoughts were beginning to quiet, not disappearing entirely, but losing their urgency, their grip, their power to paralyze me completely. I felt something I had not felt moments, the same way I had, who might be lying in bed, paralyzed by anxiety, who might be staring at the ceiling, wondering how they would make it through another day, who might be feeling overwhelmed and inadequate, and completely alone. And I wished I could tell them what I had learned this morning, what I was still learning, what I would probably have to keep learning over and over again. I wished I could tell them that it was okay to be afraid, that fear did not disqualify them from courage, that descent into unconsciousness that would restore my body, that would prepare me for tomorrow, that would give me the rest I needed. And as I drifted toward it, I felt a peace I had not felt this morning, a settledness in my spirit that came not from circumstances being resolved, but from knowing I was held by someone who was bigger than my circumstances, who was working even when I could not see it, who was present even when I could not feel it, who was faithful even when I struggled to trust it. I manufacture, but something that would be given, that was already here, already available, already surrounding me even when I could not see it. I am with you. Not I will be with you someday. Not I was with you once. Not I might be with you if you prove yourself worthy. But I am with you, present tense, right now, in this moment, in this bed, in this fear, in this weakness, in this desperate morning, where I woke feeling completely inadequate for the day ahead. With you, not watching from a when things calm down. But I am with you, right now, right here, in this moment, in this place, in this situation that makes your heart race and your hands tremble and your mind fill with doubt. With you in the meeting, with you in the conversation, with you in the decision, with you in the uncertainty, with you in the fear, with you in the weakness, with you always, everywhere, constantly, unfailingly, eternally. I walked through the door and entered the space, and though nothing about my rest and surrender, I simply received them, Let them settle into my soul. Let them become part of me in ways I did not fully understand, but knew were important, knew were life-giving, knew were exactly what my fearful heart needed to hear and keep hearing until the truth of them became stronger than the lies I had believed for too long. Tomorrow, I would rise, not because I felt ready, not because I felt strong, not because I had conquered fear, but because he had said to rise and had promised to. Else could see, he was there, he was here, he was with me, and that changed everything. I thought of Joshua, standing at the edge of the promised land, facing impossible odds, leading people into unknown territory, carrying the weight of leadership and responsibility and expectation. And I remembered the words God spoke to him, words that had been recorded thousands of years ago, but felt like they were being spoken directly to me in this moment. Words that bridge time and circumstance to meet, anxiety trying to reassert itself, trying to reclaim the territory it had held so firmly just hours ago. But this time I recognized it for what it was, acknowledged it without letting it control me, and I repeated the promise to myself like a lifeline, like an anchor, like the one true thing I could hold on to when everything else felt unstable. I am with you. Not I was with you in the quiet of your room this morning, but might not be here in the chaos of your day. Not I will be with you later, with my need to hear the same truth over and over until it finally sank deep enough to change not just my thoughts, but my instincts, my reflexes, my automatic responses to fear. The transformation from this morning's fear to this evening's peace was not the end of the journey, but the beginning. Not a destination reached, but a path discovered. Not a problem solved once and for all, but a practice established that would need to be repeated, refined, deepened over time. Each morning would be an needed, everything I had been desperately searching for, everything that could transform this moment from one of paralyzing fear to one of possible courage. Rise, not as a command to pull myself up by my own strength, not as a demand to stop being weak, not as a rebuke for my fear, but as an invitation, as a promise, as the assurance that I did not have to do this alone, that the rising would not be by my power but by His presence, that the strength I needed was not something I had to. Weakness did not disqualify them from strength. That inadequacy did not disqualify them from being loved and held and carried by the one who was more than adequate for anything they would ever face. I wished I could tell them about the promise, about the presence, about the voice that speaks into our deepest fears with the simplest and most powerful truth we could ever hear. Rise, I am with you. 3 words that could change everything if we believed them, if we trusted them, if we built our me to never give up on me, to always be with me wherever I go, whatever I face, however I feel. The last conscious thought I had before sleep claimed me completely was of the morning, of light gradually dispelling darkness, of the sun rising faithfully as it had every day of my life and would every day to come, of the way dawn always followed night no matter how long or dark the night had been. And I understood that this was a promise too, a daily reminder that darkness was not permanent, that, because we know we are not walking alone. The air in the room felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the oppressive weight that had pressed down on everything had lifted, had been replaced by something cleaner, fresher, more hopeful. I could hear the sounds of morning more clearly now, the world outside waking up fully, people beginning their days, cars starting, doors closing, life moving forward in its constant rhythm. And instead of feeling separate from it all, instead of feeling like strength, despair into hope. If you go with me, I can rise and rise again and keep rising, morning after morning, day after day, for as long as you give me breath, because your promise is true, your presence is real, and you have never failed anyone who trusted in you, and you will not fail me, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Rise, you said. I am with you, you said, and so I will rise. tomorrow, and every day after, not in my own strength, but in yours, not trusting in what I can do, but in forward, to keep going when everything in me wanted to retreat. The silence that followed felt heavy at first, felt like my words had disappeared into nothing, had been swallowed by the morning air without response, and I almost let the despair win, almost let the voice that said I was truly alone in this take over completely. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the slightest change in temperature, the faintest whisper of something other than fear entering. Fears were still present, lurking at the edges of my awareness, ready to rush back in if I gave them space. But they had been met with something stronger, something truer, something eternal, and I was learning, slowly, painfully, beautifully, that I did not have to be enough because he was, that I did not have to have all the answers because he did, that I did not have to be fearless because he was with me in my fear, and that made all the difference. I thought about others who might be waking again to either fear or peace or something in between. And I made a choice in that moment, lying in the darkness preparing for sleep, to remember this day, to hold on to the truth I had learned, to cling to the promise I had received, to trust that whatever tomorrow brought, the presence that had sustained me today would sustain me again, that the voice that had spoken courage into my fear this morning would speak again, that the God who had been with me through every moment of this day, many of these mornings, and yet it felt different somehow, felt colder, felt like even this safe space could not protect me from the weight of my own thoughts. I could hear the faint sounds of the world beginning to wake outside, the distant hum of a car passing, the soft chirping of birds greeting the dawn, the gentle rustle of wind through leaves, and it all felt so far away, so separate from this internal storm I was weathering alone. I wanted to be the kind of person who woke with gratitude, out of bed and going through the motions, but spiritual, emotional, a rising up from fear to faith, from despair to hope, from paralysis to movement, from isolation to connection. As I moved through the morning routine, washing my face, getting dressed, preparing for the day in all the ordinary ways, I found myself breathing more deeply, moving more calmly, thinking more clearly, and I realized that this transformation from fear to courage was not dramatic, not sudden, not a lightning bolt of never meant to be sufficient in myself, was created for dependence on the one who was sufficient in all things, who was strength when I had none, who was wisdom when I was confused, who was peace when I was anxious, who was courage when I was afraid. The greatest lie I had believed was that needing help was weakness, that depending on God was somehow less noble than depending on myself, that true strength meant never acknowledging my limitations, my fears, my inadequacies. But tonight, I knew, was not that the difficulties disappeared, not that the day became easy, not that I suddenly felt capable of handling everything perfectly, but rather that I was beginning to understand that my adequacy was not the point, that my strength was not the requirement, that my ability to figure everything out was not what determined whether I could rise and face this day. What mattered was that he was with me, and that was enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for whatever I would encounter. Exactly when I needed it. I thanked him for not waiting until I had my act together, for not requiring me to be strong before showing up, for not demanding that I overcome my fear on my own before offering his presence. I thanked him for meeting me in the mess, in the panic, in the tears I had not yet shed, but had felt threatening at the edges of my control. I thanked him for the promise that had changed my morning, that had given me the courage to rise, that had reminded me that I did not be with me in the rising, and that promise was the only foundation I needed, the only assurance that mattered, the only truth capable of transforming fear into courage, weakness into strength, despair into hope, paralysis into movement, darkness into light. Tomorrow I would rise, and the day after, and the day after that, for as long as he gave me breath, for as long as he called me forward, for as long as his presence was promised, and his faithfulness was proven, and his strength was available, the mark entirely. I thought about the meeting I had to attend, the difficult conversation I could not avoid, the project that felt overwhelming, the deadline that felt impossible, the expectations that felt crushing, and my chest tightened further. My breathing became shallower, and I realized I was spiraling, falling deeper into the fear, letting it consume me before I had even left this bed. I had prayed before, many times, in many moments like this. But sometimes the fear felt louder than, and had promised to be with me in the rising. And that promise was the only foundation I needed, the only assurance I required, the only truth that mattered more than all my fears combined. I opened the door and stepped out into the morning, into the light that had fully conquered the darkness, into the day that had seemed so overwhelming when I first woke, but that now felt more like an invitation than a threat, more like an opportunity than a burden, more like a journey I did not have to walk, paralyzed by fear, who had felt crushed by the weight of the coming day, who had wondered if he had the strength to rise at all. And yet I knew I was still that man, would probably be that man again tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after, because fear was not something I had conquered once and for all, but something I would need to meet again and again with the same truth, the same promise, the same presence. But that was okay. That was acceptable. That was even good somehow, because it meant darkness. And I opened my eyes again, this time not to stare at the ceiling in dread, but to see the new day being born outside my window. The sky was transforming from grey to pale blue, streaked with the first hints of pink and gold as the sun climbed higher. And I watched this daily miracle, this routine occurrence that I usually missed or ignored, and saw it differently somehow. Saw it as a promise that darkness does not last forever, that light always returns, that each morning brings with quiet into the space between waking and sleep. Then I can rise, I can face another day, I can walk through another challenge, I can keep going even when I feel weak, I can stand even when I want to fall, I can hope even when circumstances say hopeless, I can trust even when I cannot see. I can rise, not because I am strong, but because you are with me. And your presence is the only strength I need, the only courage that matters, the only truth that can transform fear into faith, weakness into, about denying my weakness, but about bringing it honestly before the one who was strong enough to carry what I could not. This was not about pretending I had it all together, but about admitting I did not, and discovering that I did not need to because he did. The freedom in that realization was staggering, the relief almost overwhelming, the sense that I could stop trying so hard to be something I was not and simply be who I was, weak and afraid and uncertain, but held by someone who was none of, tried to earn this presence, had worked to deserve his help, had exhausted myself, trying to be good enough, faithful enough, strong enough to merit his attention, his care, his intervention in my life, and how I had always fallen short, always felt inadequate, always measured myself against an impossible standard, and found myself lacking. But tonight, I understood more clearly that his presence was not something I earned, but something I received, not a reward for my performance, but a gift of his voice that was gentle but unshakable, quiet but filled with authority, tender but carrying the weight of absolute truth. It was not dramatic, not loud, not overwhelming, but it was undeniable, unmistakable, as clear as if someone had spoken directly into my heart, and the words settled into me like light breaking through clouds, like warmth spreading through cold limbs, like solid ground appearing beneath unsteady feet. Rise, I am with you. 3 simple words that somehow contained everything circumstances had changed, though the challenge was still real, and the outcome still uncertain, and my own abilities still limited. Something fundamental had shifted, something that made all the difference, even though it was invisible to everyone else in the room. I was not walking in alone. I was not relying on my own wisdom. I was not limited to my own strength. I was accompanied by the one who had spoken the universe into existence, who had promised to never leave or forsake those who trusted, not have to figure everything out, because he had already figured it out and was willing to guide me step by step if I would trust him enough to follow. I drifted deeper into sleep, my breathing steady and slow. My body relaxed in a way it had not been for days, my mind finally quiet after the chaos of anxious thoughts that had dominated my waking hours. And in that space between consciousness and unconsciousness, in that liminal place where the day ended and night took over, I felt again that faith. I carried the knowledge that I was not alone, that I did not have to be strong enough on my own, that courage was not something I had to manufacture, but something I could receive, that the day ahead was not something I had to conquer, but something I could walk through step by step with someone who knew the way even when I did not. I thought about the words again, "Rise, I am with you," and I understood them more fully now, understood that the rising was not just physical, not just getting ways I could not see, preparing the way for tomorrow, holding together all the things I could not control, being God while I simply rested in the knowledge that I did not have to be. The same God who had met me in my morning fear was with me in my evening peace, unchanged by my shifting emotions, unaffected by my fluctuating faith, constant when I was anything but constant, faithful when I was faithless, strong when I was weak, present when I felt alone. I thought about how many times I had in my own power, but in his presence. I stood up, my legs steadier than they had been, my body responding to the shift that had happened in my spirit, and I walked to the window, looking out at the morning that was now fully arrived, the sun visible on the horizon, casting long shadows, but also bathing everything in golden light. And I thought about how appropriate it was, this interplay of light and shadow, this reminder that both exist in the same space, that we carry both fear and faith, demanding that I overcome fear before showing up, but meeting me in the midst of fear and becoming my courage. The journey from this morning's fear to this evening's peace had not been a straight line, had not been smooth or simple, or without struggle, but it had been real, had been marked by the steady presence of the one who had promised to be with me, who had proven faithful in countless small ways throughout the day, in moments of unexpected clarity when I had needed wisdom, in surges into my body that felt starved of oxygen from the anxiety gripping my chest. I closed my eyes again, not to sleep, but to try to find some semblance of calm, some fragment of peace in the chaos of my mind, and I whispered into the silence, into the empty space of my room, into the morning that felt both new and oppressively familiar, a prayer that was more desperation than devotion, more cry for help than composed petition. I whispered that I was afraid, that I did not know how to do this, that I lives on them instead of on our own fluctuating feelings and failing strength. The morning sun was warm on my face as I walked, and I lifted my eyes toward it, toward the light, toward the brightness that had pushed back the darkness just as surely as his presence had pushed back my fear, and I whispered my thanks again, not with eloquent words or perfect theology, but with raw, honest gratitude for being met in my weakness, for being seen in my struggle, for being given exactly what I needed. Sense of presence, that awareness that I was not alone even in sleep, that I was held and watched over and cared for by one who never slept, who never stopped being faithful, who never stopped being present, who never stopped being enough for whatever I needed. It was not an emotion I felt, but a truth I knew, not dependent on my feelings, but existing independent of them. Solid and real and unchanging regardless of whether I could sense it strongly or barely notice it at all. The promise echoed, carry them alone. I prayed for strength for the meeting, wisdom for the conversation, clarity for the decision, grace for the relationship, patience for the process, and most of all, for the constant awareness of his presence, for eyes to see him at work, for ears to hear his voice, for a heart that remained open to his leading, even when things did not go the way I planned, even when circumstances were difficult, even when I felt my own inadequacy rising again. I prayed that I would remember this. Peace. Did not know what challenges I would face, or what strength I would need. But I knew that whatever came, wherever I went, however I felt, the promise would still be true. His presence would still be real, and that would be enough, because it had always been enough, because he had always been enough, because his faithfulness did not depend on my feelings, but existed independent of them, constant and unchanging and eternally reliable. If you go with me, I whispered into the darkness, into the be, and I thanked him for meeting me here, for not leaving me alone in my fear, for speaking into my spirit when I most needed to hear his voice, for the promise that he would be with me, not just in this room, but wherever I went today, in every moment, in every challenge, in every uncertain step. I thanked him for the reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it, to rise even when we feel weak, to trust even when we cannot see the path clearly. Comforting fiction, but reliable reality. I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to be the kind of person who did not need help, who could handle everything independently, who was strong enough and capable enough and together enough to manage life without leaning on anyone or anything, and that this self-reliance had not made me stronger but weaker, had not given me courage but fear, had not brought peace but anxiety, because I was never designed to carry everything alone. Was faith, the anxiety felt more real than peace. And I wondered if God heard me, if he saw me, if he knew how close I was to breaking, how desperately I needed him to show up, how badly I needed something to change, because I could not keep doing this, could not keep waking in fear, could not keep carrying this weight without help. The morning light grew slightly brighter, pushing back the shadows just a little, and I forced myself to take a deeper breath, forced my lungs to expand fully, forced air to face this day or any day in my own strength, because I was never meant to carry the weight alone. The world around me was alive with morning activity, people heading to work, children waiting for buses, the ordinary rhythm of ordinary lives, and I realized that we all carried invisible burdens, hidden fears, secret struggles that no one else could see, that beneath the surface of normal functioning, so many of us were fighting battles we never talked about, carrying weights that threatened to, fears and new reasons to trust, new moments to choose between walking in my own strength or leaning into his. And I knew I would not do it perfectly, would not always remember the promise immediately, would not always trust without hesitation, would not always rise without resistance. But I also knew that his faithfulness did not depend on my perfect response, that his presence was constant, even when my awareness of it was inconsistent, that he was patient with my learning, with my forgetting. It new mercy, new strength, new possibility. I felt my breathing deepen further, felt my heart rate slowing to something closer to normal, felt the panic that had gripped me beginning to release its hold, and I realized that the fear had not completely disappeared, but it had changed, had shrunk, had lost its power to control me completely because I was no longer facing it alone. I thought about the day ahead with different eyes, still aware of the challenges, still conscious of the difficulties and grace, moments of doubt and moments of unexpected strength. And through it all, I kept returning to the morning, to the moment when light had begun to dispel darkness, when fear had been met with presence, when I had heard the voice that changed everything speak into my spirit with words I would carry forever. Rise, I am with you. When I felt overwhelmed, I remembered. When I felt inadequate, I remembered. When I felt afraid, I remembered. And in the remembering, I found what I change, but rather a gentle shift, a gradual lightening, a slow dawn that had crept in while I was paying attention to the one who brought it. The fear had not been instantly obliterated, but it had been met with something stronger, had been countered with truth, had been answered with presence. And in that meeting, something had changed. Something had been restored. something had been renewed. I felt like I could breathe fully again, like the crushing weight had lifted enough for me to stand, would have repeated opportunities to experience his faithfulness, to learn again that he was trustworthy, to discover in fresh ways that his strength really was made perfect in my weakness, that his presence really was enough for whatever I faced, that his promise to never leave me was not just for good days when I felt strong, but especially for hard days when I felt weak, when I woke in fear, when I struggled to believe, when I wondered if I could keep going. I thought about tomorrow, about, before, something I could not quite name but recognized nonetheless. A presence, a nearness, a sense that I was not as alone as I thought, that someone was here with me in this struggle, that I was seen, that I was known, that my fear was not hidden or dismissed, but acknowledged and met with something stronger. Into that silence, into that subtle shift, into the space where fear had been shouting, I heard something else, not with my ears, but with something deeper, something inside my spirit, a him who had met me in my deepest fear this morning and given me the courage to rise. And that presence, that promise, that truth was with me now, would be with me throughout this day, would be with me tomorrow when I woke again, would be with me every day for the rest of my life, because it was not based on my performance, but on his character, not dependent on my strength, but rooted in his faithfulness. The day unfolded in its inevitable way, with its mix of challenges and victories, sat up slowly, my body still heavy with the lingering effects of fear and poor sleep, but no longer paralyzed, no longer trapped by the weight of anxiety, and I placed my feet on the floor, feeling the cool, solid surface beneath them, grounding me, connecting me to something real and present. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room that was now fully illuminated by morning light, and I spoke out loud this time, my voice rough from sleep but steady, stronger than I expected it to. Doorway to authentic community, the invitation for others to bring their own fears and weakness into the light, where they could be met with grace instead of judgment, with support instead of criticism, with the reminder that we all need help, we all need courage beyond our own, we all need a strength that comes from outside ourselves. I arrived at my destination, the place where I needed to be, the meeting I had been dreading, and I stood outside for a moment, feeling the familiar flutter of alone. The air outside was fresh and cool, carrying the promise of new beginnings, and I breathed it in deeply, filling my lungs with it, letting it clear away the last remnants of the panic that had gripped my chest, and I took the first step, then another, moving forward not in my own strength, but in the strength of the one who had promised to go with me, to stay with me, to never leave me to face anything alone. The day was still uncertain. The challenges were still real. The promising to be with me through all of it, not waiting on the other side of perfection, but walking alongside me through the imperfection, through the struggle, through the daily battle between faith and fear. I closed my eyes as darkness settled over the room again, as the cycle prepared to begin anew, and I whispered one final prayer, one final expression of trust and hope and dependence. I whispered that I did not know what tomorrow would bring, did not know if I would wake in fear again, or in pre-dawn darkness came to an end. I found myself thinking about the morning again, about how fear had seemed so absolute, so powerful, so capable of defining my entire day, and about how the presence of God had been more powerful still, had been the answer to every anxiety, the solution to every inadequacy, the strength behind every moment I had managed to keep moving forward. I thought about how I would wake tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and how the fear would probably be unchanging truth. It was enough. It had to be enough. It was more than enough. As I reached for the door handle, ready to step out of this room and into whatever the day would bring, I paused and whispered one more prayer, one more acknowledgement, one more expression of gratitude and dependence and hope. I whispered that I was still afraid, that I still felt weak, that I still did not know how everything would work out, but that I was choosing to trust the promise over the fear, to trust his. Struggles had ended, but because I had been reminded of what was true, had been reassured of what was real, had been reconnected to the source of strength that was always available even when I forgot to access it. I thanked him again for meeting me in my fear, for not being disappointed by my weakness, for offering presence instead of rebuke, for giving courage instead of condemnation, for loving me not as I wished I was, but as I actually was, with all my flaws and failures and fears, and capable and confident, but because I was no longer trying to do this alone, no longer trying to be sufficient in myself, no longer operating under the crushing assumption that my strength was all I had to work with. I had been met in my weakness, spoken to in my fear, lifted up in my desperation, and given a promise that was more solid than any of my circumstances, more reliable than any of my feelings, more powerful than any of my obstacles. I am with you. Present tense. Current reality.